Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming again today. If you came last week, and I'm glad you're here, whether or not you came last week. In a minute, I'll recap a little bit briefly what we talked about last time. Then I'll talk about what we're going to talk about this time, and then I'll share my screen to share a study sheet with you so that we can go through some texts and think about this subject, which is, what does it mean for God to remember? First, I just want to say, to flesh out my background a little bit more, you may be looking at me and my gray beard and thinking, how did this guy just get a PhD 2 years ago? Did they hold him back for 22 years? And basically, I came to it very late. So because I came to study late, and because, Julie mentioned one of the books I co-wrote with Akiva Tatz was Letters to a Buddhist Jew, I have a checkered background. I come to this with a beginner's mind in a way. When I married a very observant Jewish woman with 2 little girls who said, if we're going to do this, you've got to be part of a Jewish home, that was the beginning of my Jewish education in earnest. And I had a lot of catching up to do because she is a very observant, very literate Jewish person. And it took me, the process is still going, but I don't really come at it, even though I have a PhD as an academic, I come at it from the crisis I had learning about Judaism, which was, where is the spirit in this? Where is the mindfulness? I went looking for it, and back when I had my spiritual crisis, the only place you could find contemplative practice was in Buddhism. There really wasn't, at the time that I decided Judaism wasn't making sense, the only place I could go was a Zen center. So I studied Zen meditation pretty seriously for 4 years. And that was kind of an entry back into Jewish practice and Jewish learning. And that was how I got interested in the topic of Jewish memory, because memory, after all, what is it but a form of mindfulness? And last week we talked a little bit about what are we supposed to remember? What is memory actually? We talked about the 2 Hebrew roots that have to do with memory, zecher and pakad, both being sort of synonymous but slightly different. The root of zikaron, zecher, really meaning to commemorate, to remember, to call to mind, to bring the past into the present. And the root pakad, lifkod, really predominantly having the amazing message, not only of bringing to mind, but of also of helping a woman conceive a child. When God remembers a woman, as we'll see in the study sheet, he facilitates her, especially when she is having trouble conceiving, he facilitates conception. And what is memory, after all, but the ability to facilitate a conception, to bring something to conception that was previously out of reach. Importantly for Jewish memory, and at this time of year it's super important, we have to reorient ourselves toward memory. It doesn't only mean calling back to mind what happened, it also means remembering our stories as the glue that binds us together as a people and that moves us through history with a consciousness of our covenantal obligations. And what's important about this is that Rosh Hashanah is called Yom HaZikaron for exactly this reason. It's a time of spiritual and mnemonic realignment. Whether or not you go to shul all the time or never, whether you believe in God or think organized religion is nonsense, whether Rosh Hashanah is a meaningful holiday to you or you're still trying to get your arms around it, or a little bit of both, memory is the spine that runs along this time of year, around which we can build the musculature of really feeling connected to people. And right now, as I'm sure you know, that's so, so important. If you're at all like me, you find Zoom a little difficult, especially if, like me, you're spending lots of time on Zoom right now. It is wonderful to see faces from all across the country, don't get me wrong. And I love that so many of you that I can see are smiling. And I love imagining seeing so many of you who are not showing your pictures, like in your bathrobe with a cup of coffee, with your feet up, you know, maybe the kids are on their computer because they have to be at school. In other words, I will remember this as a difficult but opportune moment, and I hope you will too. So with that, I want to welcome you. I'm going to share my screen in a second. I would like you to enter into the chat if you are so inclined, and thank you, Julie, for linking to the source sheet there for people who want to look at it separately. If you're so inclined, please enter into the chat sort of how you're feeling about the high holidays right now, what your orientation is toward it. Are you excited? Are you blah? Is it meaningful? Are you depressed because you can't physically be with people? Just give me some idea of where you are, because that's going to help me sort of understand how to approach you this week. So, Hank is confused. Welcome to the club, Hank. It's a big one. Isolated. I mean, this is, Maureen says she feels isolated. I'm glad that Barry feels curious and excited. This is a good way to feel right now. If you're not Jewish, it's awesome that you're here because you have beginner's mind, which we all should have. And Melody says she wants to be with her synagogue family because she's a new convert. Melanie, Brucha Haba'ah, welcome. And we're glad that you're with us, and we hope that you can continue to be with Jewish people in whatever way is possible. And I'm grateful to see somebody here from Panama. That is pretty amazing. It's a place I've always wanted to go and never been. I have a brother-in-law who owns a dive shop in Panama. So someday I'm going to get there. So what I want us to think about today as we read these texts is the following. We talked a little bit, as I said last week, about what we should remember and what memory is, and a teeny tiny bit about how God remembers. But that's really our focus this week. What do we mean? What does it mean to say that God remembers? If God, in the Jewish conception, is omniscient, omnipotent, all-knowing, how can God need to remember? Because theoretically, an omniscient, omnipotent, all-knowing being would never forget. So what does it mean that that God has a memory as well? And that Yom HaZikaron, the day of memory, the original name for Rosh Hashanah, applies not just to us, but it applies to God as well. To start considering this, we're going to look at this week's, a couple of selections from this week's Torah portion, Vayelech Nitzavim Vayelech, and we're coming down the home stretch of Moses's summation of all that has gone on to the Israelites in the desert. I'm wondering if somebody would read this section that I have up on the screen now, Deuteronomy 29, 9 to 14. Julie, if you could help me identify a willing volunteer to read this out loud. I would love to hear a voice other than my own read this section. Does anybody want to do that?
If anyone wants to read, you can put that in the chat or use the raise hand function and then unmute yourself. Great, Pamela, was that a?
Okay, if we have two, then the second one can read the next thing I want to have read.
Okay, it looks like we have two. Great, so Melody, we'll start with you.
Okay. Deuteronomy 29, 9 through 14. You stand this day, all of you, before the Lord your God, your tribal heads, your elders, and your officials, all the men of Israel, your children, your wives, even the stranger within your camp, from wood chopper to water drawer, to enter into the covenant of the Lord your God, which the Lord your God is concluding with you this day, with its sanctions, to the end that he may establish you this day as his people and be your God, as he promised you and as he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I make this covenant with its sanctions, not with you alone, but both with those who are standing here with us this day before the Lord our God, and with those who are not with us here this day.
Thank you, Melody, very much. We could go on all day just about this, but here's what I want to say about this for the purposes of thinking about Rosh Hashanah. The rabbis who designed this whole system really knew what they were doing, because we come down the home stretch of Moses's out loud ethical will right at the time of year when we ourselves are renewing the covenant. We read about the covenant being entered into in the first place, because we are to feel that we are entering into it today, now, as if for the first time. Looking at this, you can see that there is a clear hierarchy, and unfortunately, the place, it goes from top to bottom, which is interesting because you see that tribal heads are at the top, then elders, then officials, then just guys, then children, then women, then menial laborers. As unfortunate as that is to our eyes today, this is a radically egalitarian thing for a covenant to do in its day and age. And that is, it includes everybody, everybody who's physically present and everybody who's not. Now, if we think of this, as the rabbis encourage us to do, not only in terms of large communities, but in terms of our individual selves, what this passage is calling on you to do at this time of year is to summon all of your faculties, from the right and left hemisphere of your brain, to your heart, to your musculature, to your nerve endings, to your sinews, to your bones, all the way down to your large and small intestines. I mean, this is an embodied experience we're being asked to have. As we are called upon to re-enter this, we're asked to come with our full selves. And what is the community, after all, if it is not a representation of a full self? So that is the framework on which I want us to hang how we think about the Day of Memory. Now, Julie, who was the second person who raised their hand? And I would love them to read this section.
Okay, who would like to read?
Didn't we have a second volunteer that last time?
Yes, I'm trying to remember.
Are they being shy now?
Okay, Ellen.
And it is in the heavens that you should say, who among us can go to the heavens and get it for us and import to us, that we may observe it? Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who among us can cross to the other side of the sea and get it for us and impart it to us, that we may observe it? No, the thing is very close to you, in your mouth, and it is in your heart to observe it.
Thank you very much, Ellen. In line with what I said previously, if we think about this in terms of not only our community, but ourselves, what Moses is saying is, everything I've taught you, everything I've told you, everything imparted to you from God is not incomprehensible and impossible to execute. It's in you. It's physically, kinesthetically, as well as intellectually and emotionally in you. Remember, the heart in ancient Near Eastern thought is not just an organ that pumps blood. It is the seat of the emotions and the intellect. And it is in both that seat and in your mouth to do these things. So this year, bring all of your embodied self and the connection between how you speak and how you feel and think to this task. Next, I want to look at, and I'll read a couple of things, and then I'll ask others to read more. I want us to look at a couple of verses from the Rosh Hashanah Mahzor about what God's memory is. The astonishing thing that I hope you'll see by the time we're done today is that we, human beings, sort of prompt God's memory. Here we are in relation to the creator of the universe, telling that creator how to do a thing called remembering. It could well be, some think, and we'll see the scholars who propose this toward the end of this sheet, some think that we have to give God a model for how to remember, because God is omniscient and doesn't even know what remembering is. In order to engage with human beings, God needs a model. And who is that model? You and me. So there are verses in the High Holiday Machzor called Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. Verses about kingship, verses about memory, and verses about the shofar. 3 aspects of the day's experiences that we want to use to connect God back to us with renewed energy, devotion, and love. And here's one of those Zichronot verses, and I want you to notice how it talks to God about memory. You remember the dealings of humanity in today's world. And you also consider the behavior of all those who lived in earlier times. In your presence are revealed all hidden things and the multitude of secrets from the beginning of creation. For there is no forgetfulness before your throne of glory, and there is nothing hidden from your eyes. This sounds a lot like Moses in the passage that we just read, that it is about everybody who's here and everybody who's not here. But we are gently telling God, it would appear, that even though there's no forgetfulness before God's throne, God still needs to remember. There's a paradox here that is central to what we have an opportunity to do at Rosh Hashanah. Whether we believe in God or not, whether we go to synagogue or not, whether or not we're grizzled veterans of Judaism or newcomers, and that is to engage our full selves in modeling covenantal behavior so that God can imitate us. This is not how it's usually presented, but I want to propose to you here that this is one of the radical opportunities behind Rosh Hashanah, that we are engaged on Rosh Hashanah in a mutual process of reminding between ourselves and God, and if we don't believe in God, between ourselves and the rest of the members of our community. Because it's through collective action, not just thought, but action, that we raise ourselves together and bind ourselves together with each other. I'm going to scroll quickly through a couple of examples to show you the kinds of things that God remembers. For example, God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark. And God caused a wind to blow across the earth and the waters subsided. If you go back and read the flood story, which we'll actually be doing in a few weeks, you'll note that God hasn't forgotten Noah. So what does it mean that God remembers Noah? I'm going to leave that for a second. And when the story ends, here's what God says. I've set my bow in the clouds, and it shall serve as a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. So here the covenant is not with Israel, it's with the entire planet. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow appears in the cloud, I will remember my covenant between me and you, and every living creature among all flesh, so that the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy flesh. So when God says this, he is saying, Vayizkor, and I will remember. It doesn't mean, oops, forgot to pick up Noah at the divine supermarket of human life. It means, I bring you back to mind. I place you at the top of my acting in the world. Here's the radical idea behind all this. The God that exists beyond time cares deeply about the creatures who exist in time. So God must intrude into the plane of history to make these things happen. And it is God moving, if you will, from the vertical plane of timeless time down to the horizontal plane of lived experience. That is the act of divine remembering. When God acts with his creation in mind, that is God remembering. One of the seismic events that we remember, and I talked about this last week briefly, about remembering ruptures as opportunities to rediscover divine care. One of those ruptures that we remember is the Exodus. But prior to the Exodus, in the book of Exodus, we note that God remembers. And here it says, God heard the moaning of the Israelites and remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. We have several different kinds of memory. We're called upon to execute a higher kind of memory at this time of year. But as human beings, we think, as I've said, about memory as, what was that thing I was supposed to do today? Or where was I when, 9/11 happened? But it's more than that. For us, it's what was happening with my people. Even though I was physically not there, I was there. And for God, it is time for me to intrude upon the plane of history. I'm going to scroll past a couple of these because time is flying past. This is interesting in Leviticus when God gives the laws about Rosh Hashanah and says, speak to the Israelite people. Thus, in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall observe complete rest, a sacred occasion commemorated with loud blasts. V'hayu lachem lezikaron bifnei Elohechem, ani Hashem Elohechem. So it's commemorated with blasts from the shofar. It is not only commemorated, but that blast itself is a mnemonic event. Now I need somebody else to read. And I want that volunteer to read these next 2 passages from Samuel. This is Hannah praying to God and what happens when she asks God to remember her. And this is Hannah, the mother of Samuel. Michelle raised her hand, so I wonder if she would read it.
Sure. And she made this vow, O Lord of hosts, if you will look upon the suffering of your maidservant, and will remember me and not forget your maidservant, and if you will grant your maidservant a male child, I will dedicate him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor shall ever touch his head.
And read the next one.
Early next morning, they bowed low before the Lord, and they went back home to Ramah. Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her.
Now, both times here, the root pakad is not used, but the root zecher is used. God remembers Hannah, not just in a way to facilitate pregnancy, although these are nearly synonymous. I want to suggest to you that Hannah, making this prayer, makes her into a kind of memorial. He commemorates her ability to pray. And if you don't know the story, or even if you do, it's worth pointing out that Hannah is the mother of prayer in the Israelite tradition. Her moving her lips rapidly and muttering sotto voce is mistaken by the priest at this temple as her being a drunkard. And he says, get out of here, you drunkard. I'm paraphrasing, of course, the Bible is much more eloquent. And she says, I'm not drunk, my Lord, I'm praying. And he says, then I hope your prayer is answered. Her moving her lips quickly and praying quietly has helped shape the way that Jews pray even to this day. And when we pray that way, we are, in a real sense, remembering Hannah. We are imitating her, we are embodying her, we are invoking her, And we are trying to bring down God's memory, God's intrusion into the plane of history. Okay. So we've talked about what divine memory is, but we also have to talk about how God is depicted in rabbinic text in very human terms, and ask ourselves what it means. And after I share these next two things, I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a moment so that I can see your thoughts in the chat and respond to some of those. And then we'll come back to the sheet before we end. So this is from a rabbinic midrash, a pretty late one, about the 9th century of the Common Era. And this is God speaking about Rosh Hashanah and the trial that we essentially undergo on Rosh Hashanah. Could I get somebody else? I'm getting sick of the sound of my own voice. Could I get somebody else to read this?
Linda, you're up.
When you appear before me for trial on Rosh Hashanah, come with the shofar. Then, even if there are many accusers against you, I shall recall Isaac's Akedah and acquit you. Now, what is it like with a shofar? A person...
Uh-oh.
I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. Somebody else has to continue.
Okay. She did a very good job. Now, does somebody else want to start over?
I lost the text, and the text is not on the printout, so I don't see it on the printout.
Oh.
So I apologize.
Okay,
No
sorry
worries.
about that.
Michelle, do you want to read again?
And it didn't come back.
If you refresh, it might come back. Michelle, are you there? Maybe not.
David, you can always call on me.
Julie.
Okay, we're at the Psikta Rabati.
Yeah.
When you appear before me for trial on Rosh Hashanah, come with the shofar. Then, even if there are many accusers against you, I shall recall Isaac's Akedah and acquit you. Now, what is it like with a shofar? A person blows into one end and the sound comes out at the other end. So too with your children. And even if there are many accusations against them, I let the accusations go in one ear and out the other.
This is amazing. This is one of my favorite texts of all in Midrash, because it suggests that part of divine memory is in fact forgetting that the shofar, the blast of the shofar, is not just a mnemonic device. It is reminding God to forget certain things. And certainly if you are on trial before the creator of the universe and beseeching that creator to acquit you, essentially, then certain things will have to be let slide. We think of the blast of the shofar on Rosh Hashanah as a call to collective action and urgency, and the shattering sound of God appearing before the Israelites at Sinai. And it is all those things, but it's also something remarkable in just the way that it functions. It reminds God that certain things should be forgotten. Its very presence, its very physical structure means that some things have to come and go. And in this way, it gives us an important spiritual lesson for this time of year. I don't know about you, but I spoke about this last week about a run-in with a woman in a park who was doing yoga in the middle of a path and was upset that I got within 6 feet of her. And it made me, and driving, I live in Chicago, where drivers are usually fairly placid, and now all of a sudden they're extremely aggressive. It feels like people are agitated and angry, understandably so. insecure, feeling pressed in on in every way. The shofar reminds us eloquently and elegantly in its very shape that we have to be able to let things go. And at this time of year, we come together as a community, ask each other for forgiveness. Let the things that I've done that have offended you come into you and leave you. And we ask God to do the same thing. Act like a person. Act like a forgiving person. Let what I've done go in one ear and out the other. In essence, to move through the divine being and be relegated to the dustbin of history. But we do call upon God's memory to recall the things that we've done that are good. And essentially, what is good? We want our acts and our lives to have meaning. And this says that the things that you've done, the accusations that you face, I will judge them not to have meaning. The accusations against you won't have meaning. But your meritorious deeds, the love you express, the space you give other people, those things have meaning. Sifrei Devarim is another work of rabbinic midrash in which this astonishing idea appears, and it appears in other midrashim as well. And Julie, it's very short, but I would like to ask you to read this one too, because it contains a radical theological idea that I think is very important for this time of year.
Okay. Similarly, and you are my witnesses, says the Lord, and I am God. When you are my witnesses, I am God. And if you are not my witnesses, I am not God.
I just want us to sit and think about that for a moment. The prophet Isaiah says, you are my witnesses and I am God. And the rabbis take the radical step, as they do in Midrash, of putting words in God's mouth and then making it canonical text so that it essentially becomes God's words. And God says, through the mouths, as it were, of the rabbis, that when you don't see me as God, as it were, kivyachol, I'm not. If you don't see me as God, you deprive me of the ability to be that for you. What does this mean for us at this time of year? How can we accommodate this radical idea as something that a divine being might actually say to a people to whom that being is covenanted? I'd like to suggest to you that what this means is, and I'm going to say from a theological perspective and then from a sociological perspective. From a theological perspective, it means that what we do makes God what God is in the world. It's an astonishing, astonishing idea. And the part that this quote that I set in the text doesn't include is the rabbi saying, if it were not written, it could not be said out loud. What they're referring to is Isaiah's statement, when you are my witnesses and I am God. What they say they're seeing in the cracks and fissures of the texts is the idea that when you're not my witnesses, this must mean, if the positive is true, so is the negative. When you are my witnesses, I am God. That must mean when you're not my witnesses, then I ain't God. What we do manifests divinity in the world. You don't have to believe in God. You're certainly welcome to. But you don't have to believe in God. This is a profoundly ethical statement. And this is the time of year when we have to be reconnecting to this idea. The idea is, when we gather in community, when we recommit, when we make new memories of each other, we raise up divinity in the world. And when we do the opposite, we do the opposite to divinity. It's a radical, amazing, stunning idea. And I want you to remember it on Rosh Hashanah, because I think it's exactly what we're about when we're in community, however that might be. Okay, we're already somehow coming down the home stretch. I have 2 more texts that I want to share, and they are from Nehemiah Polan, who is a scholar who teaches at Hebrew College in Boston, about God's memory. And they're 2 separate texts, so I want to pause in the middle of them and get 2 different volunteers if people aren't shy about reading. So I want someone to read this first one, beginning, "Whatever we forget."
Leah Root.
Dorinda. Oh, did I call on somebody and you called on somebody different?
Sorry.
Okay, so whoever you called on will read the second.
Leah Root has put in the chat that she was happy to read.
So let her do the first one, and then Dorinda will do the second one?
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay. Whatever we forget, God remembers, but whatever we remember, God forgets. Consider our mitzvot, our good deeds. If we remember them with pride and self-satisfaction, if we consider them our ticket to heaven or to a life of honor here on earth, then God forgets them. On the other hand, if we forget them, not claiming virtue for ourselves or special privilege in consequences of our good deeds, then God remembers those good deeds and cherishes them.
Now, I'm not sure if Professor Polan is just being playful here, but you know, the rabbis are playful in Midrash. There's nothing wrong with being playful. The playfulness and the creativity of these ideas are what help renew our position toward them. And to me, and I will ask for your thoughts in the chat in just a moment, to me, and you're welcome to put them in now, but because of my screen and my technological deficiencies, I won't be able to see them just now. But to me, what this says is that when we act with humility, then God will remember our deeds. Meaning, it's not all about us. This is the time of year for us to be in community, to submit ourselves to being smaller than ourselves, to not put ourselves at the center of the universe. When we do that, we raise up divinity in our midst. This is certainly a time, regardless of your political or spiritual orientation, for collective action. There is a need for people to be more together. And when you say for people to be more, when I say for people to be more together, I mean both getting your SHIT together, but also being more together collectively in community. And this is saying, when you act with humility, you cause divinity to remember. That's precisely our task at this time of year. And then this second one, Dorinda, are you still there? Could you still read what that begins with God's memory?
Sure.
Thank you.
God's memory is what impels us to action and buttresses our hopes in the face of the abyss. But God's memory is a hopeful concept only through the collective decision of the people to persevere memories as sacred, to cherish them, and most importantly, to study and teach them and transmit them. To conclude, if God is a memory, it is because we give him ours. But what then does God give us? The 2 things that make memory worth having: a vision of integrity and the courage to hope.
If God has a memory, it's because we give him ours. Thank you, Dorinda, by the way. And in exchange, he gives us vision and hope. So precisely at this time of year, we are seeking to sync up human memory and divine memory. We're seeking to make ourselves smaller so that as a community, we can feel more as one. And we're reminding God, meaning making ourselves present to God, of our humility and our humanity so that God can remember. And God remembering means exiting that celestial plane and entering into history, coming, as it were, into human existence and human experience so that we can live with a recommitment to covenant, meaning to each other, to an ethical life, to a life of love, and to the sacredness of the coming together of past, present, and future in holy togetherness. In the last few minutes, if you just want to enter any questions or thoughts in the chat, I will try to respond to them, especially because I saw Steve say he tried to ask this last time. Steve paraphrases Nietzsche and says that in life in any true sense is absolutely impossible without forgetfulness. Yes, this is certainly true. Nietzsche lived at a time when people were fascinated with history, and Nietzsche thought history was a waste of time, that people were remembering too much, and that we had to forget more, that forgetfulness was actually a good thing. And recently there's been some scholarship, because memory was such a hot topic in scholarship for a while, collective memory. People were like, memory's overblown. We have too much information. We're on the internet all the time. We need to forget more. But if you've learned something today, I hope one of the things you've learned is that memory and forgetting are indispensable to each other. They're interlinked. We're asking God to forget, to have God know that things should go in one ear and out the other. We have to do that too. There is a lot at this time of year that we have to not hold on to. And I want to beg you, by the way, from a personal point of view, speaking of not holding on to, that if you have someone from whom you need forgiveness, this is a traditional practice, but it is really important to this time of year. In terms of letting things go in one ear and out the other. If you have someone that you need to forgive so that you can move on, if there's any opportunity for you to do it, and if you have the emotional bandwidth to do it now. Do it now. Judaism asks us to do it now, and this is part of the way we sync up ourselves with each other and make more space for the divine in the world, by removing the thorns and thistles of our inability to move on and to forget. Does anybody else have any last comments, questions, or complaints they'd like to share? Julie is the complaint department, so complain to her.
Yeah.
Yes, Joan, I see you raising your hand.
1 second. Who is it?
Joan, but you're still muted.
Go ahead, Joan.
All right.
Oh, there you go.
Here's what I struggle with in the past when I've worked with women or children who have been abused. And I find that I have a lot of difficulty when asking them to let it be forgotten. They struggle with this request, and they struggle with the idea that, and survivors too, because I've worked with a lot of survivors, the idea that they are being asked, they think anyway in their minds, to let it go, when actually they don't want to let it go, because that in a way they feel is Jewish tradition denying what they have experienced. And so I struggle with it.
Right. So I'll address this briefly. It's a massive topic, and I'm really grateful for your bringing it up. Although we're already at the end of our time, and I would say this: we have to be mindful. So part of memory is mindfulness. It's being mindful of. So for the purposes, and I'm not a therapist, so I don't want to tell you what to do or say to your clients.
I'm
but
not
for
either,
me,
I'm a rabbi. So
okay. So for me, the critical distinction to be made is between forgiving and forgetting. So because memory requires a kind of mindfulness, and because forgetting, in our terms, for this purpose, is not the opposite of memory, but is closely aligned to memory, forgiving does not include forgetting. So forgiving requires continued vigilance and perception. And the scars of trauma cannot be washed away. The Jewish people collectively are evidence of that fact. And whether or not we put store in recent epigenetic research, evidence seems to suggest that when ancestors of ours experience trauma, we will inherit the genetic markers of that trauma. So to ask somebody to forget what is physically embedded in them is impossible. It is not impossible to ask them to work on forgiveness as a process, and it is a process. It never ends. The credits don't roll. People don't live happily ever after, but if they embark upon the path of forgiveness, they will discover radical new vistas of being that they will have previously thought were closed to them. It's not a magic sauce or a cure-all, but it's the willingness to consider the possibility of forgiveness, not forgetting, that helps people move forward. I want to thank you all. I want to beg you to embrace each other and all the people around you. I want you to remember all the people around you for good and let their bad deeds go in one ear and out the other. Let those family members whose views aren't the same as yours be loved by you. Let their incendiary statements go in one ear and out the other. It is a practice. Practice it with me. Breathe more deeply. Call yourself into community. And remember that remembering includes a kind of forgetting, which is really forgiving. That is, letting the other be who they are and trying as hard as you can to enter back into community, even through these little squares on your screen, so that we can move forward as one people composed of thousands of different examples of humanity. I want to wish you Shana Tova, and I want to say that I hope you will join me on Rosh Hashanah day itself so that we can talk about the shofar and about the most difficult story of radical devotion, forgiving, and transformation, and that is the story of the binding of Isaac.